Dobré odpoledne, good afternoon. Já vás tady vítám na další diskusi, další debatě tohoto dne, která se bude týkat také instituce, také možná odpovědnosti a všeho, co s tím souvisí. My jsme si dovolili pozvat k této debatě Adama Szymczyka, uměleckého ředitele Documenty 14 a jako sparring partnera, tazatele a diskutujícího Michala Novotného, který s námi spolupracuje dlouhodobě jako asociovaný kurátor a zároveň je ředitelem pražské galerie Futura. Já doufám, že ten dnešní den vlastně vytvoří takový jakoby oblouk nebo vytvoří takovou strukturu 3 bloků, kde se určité spojující téma najde a doufám, že nám vyplyne na povrch, až se z toho zítra vyspíme. Takže pěkné odpoledne a welcome.
Také dobrý den. Já se všem nejprve omluvím, že budeme mluvit anglicky, přestože jsme v Ostravě a jsme Čech a Polák, ale už jste si všichni už se zařídili ta sluchátka na ten simultánní překlad. Jenom já se ještě poprosil jednou, kdybyste odcházeli, tak prosím neodcházejte s těmi sluchátky. So maybe also Adam will forgive me, but actually the first question I would like to ask is to ask you, and I would like to ask, again, if you forgive me, if you can raise your hand, who has seen the Documenta exhibition in Kassel? Quite few. And who of you has seen the Documenta exhibition in Athens? Okay, thank you. Thank you again, Adam, for coming despite the problems with the flight. And I think that we will start directly. So the exhibition motto was learning from Athens, but there was also a lot very often used in the press materials and in the text that you wrote, the word uneducation. So how does these two goes together?
I never thought about it, so you're surprising me. But I guess, yes. I mean, the title, which I must say was always meant to be the working title to stay, so it was a kind of working title that never changed into a proper title. So, Documenta 14 in itself is already a pretty good title, we thought, so we just added this other title, Learning from Athens, as a kind of a teaser to provoke a discussion and to make people ask questions, which indeed happened. Learning from Athens, because in the first place Athens was and remains a place of learning on different levels, beginning with the tradition of classic Greek philosophy, up to the current lessons that can be taken from a sad predicament in which Greece has been inserted through the decision of basically creditors, international organizations and corporate entities that sort of brought the country to a state of controlled coma, reducing the state that is nominally sovereign to the state of a state that is a zombie, basically. So a zombie does not have any agency of its own, mostly. It has an agency that is fully depending on whichever powers brought zombie to the sort of second life after a person was put to death. So Okay, so that would be an excursus, maybe explaining a little bit why we wanted to learn something in and from Athens. And secondly, of course, that very nature of learning was something that we wanted to kind of put on a table as a target to be shot at, rather than as an affirmation of a certain concept of learning that is embedded in a type of thinking that presupposes a top-down relationship between those who teach and those who learn. So that was exactly where the discussion we had internally about the concept of the so-called Vermittlung, or art education or art mediation in Documenta, came into play. And obviously we wanted to relate this new form and new type of practice of some sort of education to traditions of critical pedagogy, which we thought were not really used within the realm of contemporary art, and therefore the notion of uneducation, which is at the same time a kind of an education, meaning education without a specific qualifier, and on the other hand, uneducation as a kind of negation of education, kind of dialectical contradiction, came into a kind of semantic field in which we were moving. So to explain, the titles and names, that would be more or less something to begin with.
And do you think that you succeed in this, or is the success the kind of right word to speak about if you're pursuing a project like that? Concerning the uneducation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure if Bauhaus, for instance, succeeded in that sense. Whether it was a successful way of processing the audience through the exhibition, probably not, but it was also not the intention of the type of relation that we wanted to propose between the different actors constituting the kind of event of an exhibition. I think, to me, it has to do more with an idea of an exhibition as an experience, as a phenomenon that is stretching both in space or spaces and in time, and therefore it's difficult to reduce to any particular kind of script or set knowledge, which could be then transmitted or communicated from the side of those who know, meaning curators, art educators, art connoisseurs, and the whole support system of contemporary art world, to those who are supposed not to know, and that would be, the so-called audience, which maybe doesn't really exist, which has to be somehow constructed as a uniform entity in order to be then exposed to this top-down educational regime. So that was a kind of model that we wanted to avoid, and I think we pretty much avoided it successfully. And in that sense, uneducation was a success in some way. In some other way, it was also a failure, because it was a failure especially in relation to the dimension or the kind of multiplicity of levels on which Documenta 14 and any other project of this magnitude is played out, and namely it is very difficult to provide services of educational kind to an audience that is estimated to be near 1 million visitors within 163 days and spread between 2 cities and several languages and so forth. So in a way, the type of event which is diffused, and I'm often referring to to the saying of one of the previous artistic directors of Documenta, Roger Burgel, who was the curator of Documenta 12 together with Ruth Noack, and who said in the, I think in the opening essay of one of the issues of the magazine that they produced at that time, that the large exhibition has no form. So the large exhibition has no form, so it is a kind of diffuse experience, and for such experience I think it's very difficult to find a coherent equivalent in educational process, simply because it is not coherent as an experience. So it involves a game of many incoherences, and it's very difficult to translate, and therefore my claim would be that the exhibition is rather there to be experienced and to be lived in a way, than to be, kind of packaged into a formula of knowledge, which could be sent like a package to a visitor.
Maybe once more coming back to the items, what was also very often discussed was the role of Athens and the role of the relocating this Documenta to the Athens, or at least mirroring the Documenta from the Athens. So how this physical move should be read for you also in relation to the history of Documenta as the exhibition that was started in 1955 by Arnold Bode and has this history of 13 previous itinerations.
Yeah, I mean, it has a history of, it had a history at that time of 13 iteration, but it was not a very itinerant project. So it was pretty much bound to Kassel to such a degree that it became like a sort of trademark almost, which is a sort of top selling point for the marketing of the city of Kassel. So it's a kind of definition of the identity of the city of Kassel, which is a kind of positive definition. It's a kind of positively connotated thing, Documenta, Stadt, Kassel. So I guess this is a try to, by a city to assume a new identity, first of all, after the destruction of the Second World War, and kind of obliterating the very reasons or sources of this destruction, namely in the history of the rise of the Nazi ideology in Germany and the attendant role of industries in this process. And Kassel was an important center of military industries in Germany, and it remains this center. So somehow Documenta is also, in my view, today becoming something like a form of strategy. It's like a part of the strategy of detraction, of kind of shifting the attention to artistic freedom of a Documenta at the cost of not really centering on the kind of industrial base of the city, which is pretty much still in the military industry and few other industries that are present there.
The fact that Documenta, as you said, wasn't a package or wasn't something that could be coherently taken, but rather experience, how does this reflect it in the way of directing it as a director? How it was organized in some ways? In my experience being there, it was kind of very loose structure that had a certain life of its own. Is it right, or did it only feel like that? Or how is the rigidity of it, or a certain looseness in the frame of view as an artistic director towards the artists or towards the daily employees of Documenta?
I mean, you know, before I answer this question, maybe I would go back to the previous question, which was about the reasons for this kind of dislocation. So to begin with Documenta in another place, I think this was important, and it was a move in order to, you know, introduced in order to kind of destabilize the expectation of a singular beginning at the outset of the project, and of course one could say that you know, there's the whole range of contrasts and contradictions that could be observed when you look at both cities. One is big, the other is small. One is in prosperous north, the other one is in a kind of collapsing south. One has a relatively short and brutal history, you know, including a kind of cultural and sort of scientific developments during the reign of certain landgraves of Hessia, who resided in Kassel, and the other cities, this many times interrupted but somehow grand history of Mediterranean culture and the famous cradle of European civilization and philosophy. So we thought that there would be sufficient reasons, on the one hand, not to expect Documenta in Athens at that very point. When the project was formulated, it was 2013, and it was kind of past the peak of attention of the Greek crisis, or rather what is called the Greek crisis. On the other hand, the hardship of the situation and the conditions in which people actually lived at that point in Athens were not much better, and probably actually pretty much worse than those at the point when the crisis was first declared as existing, which was 2009. At the same time, the interesting part of public debate, or the language that was used in it, was that there was definitely a narration present in which Germany would be on the side of the teacher, you know, telling the Greeks and the South in general how to improve their management, how to get things done, and how to abandon certain habits that simply brought the country to the brink of destruction. So we thought that there would be maybe ways of changing this direction of teaching, and maybe also trying to propose that there would be things to learn in Athens at that very point. And quite naturally, the relocation of the beginning of the exhibition to Athens produced quite a strange feeling among the audience, something like, you know, one could maybe compare it to something like Phantom Limb, where basically Documenta is already there, but those who know what Documenta is do not really acknowledge this fact, and they still sort of think that the Documenta proper will happen in Kassel, while for us it was more like that the initial move and the kind of generative power of the exhibition was definitely in Athens, and Kassel was more on the receiving side and the reflecting side, and the kind of post examination of the state of things. Also through the fact that all artists who were invited to make new works for the exhibition or to show their existing works first worked on their contributions for Athens, and then they had to kind of retake on it 6 weeks later or so in Kassel. So that was the previous question, and now the new question came.
Maybe we can skip to another question then. in relation to what you just answered. But then, what you also said, that the Documenta part in Athens was not actually about Athens only, that it was rather mirroring this city as being part of a larger international, something that maybe we could call a global south. Would you agree with this, like, with the interpretation that I'm giving, or how was actually the very often also questioned relation of Documenta to the Athens, to the local art scene, to the actual problems of the city, or how this relation should have been or have been established as in this non-hierarchical level that you're saying?
Yeah, but if you ask 10 Athenians what are the actual problems of the city, they will give you 10 different answers. And, you know, obviously there is a huge unemployment and the economy is completely drained, there is no investments and so forth, but these are kind of basics that you can read in the newspaper.
Yeah, but I think I'm just trying to say that some people expect that the Documenta will be about Athens.
Yeah, I mean, many people expect many different things.
Yeah, no, but I'm sure.
Some people probably expected the Documenta is going to be about Athens in a specific way. And also many people expected many things about, you know, the part of the show that took place in Kassel. But I think we have provided quite a lot of moments in the exhibition which thoroughly reflected, for instance, on the kind of history of formation of certain stereotypes that are defining the perception of Greece, for instance, and Athens in particular, you know, in the kind of Western European / US American culture. And we went pretty far in kind of uncovering the beginnings of the shaping of the Greek state in the 19th century through a common agreement of at that time the superpowers and the role of Greece as a kind of experimental field for creation of a kind of model nation state, like kind of the nation state which replaces, in this case, a very complex ethnic mosaic of the Ottoman Empire, during which period different ethnicities and different confessions existed next to each other. So this is being replaced by a kind of more uniform concept in which the religion is the Orthodox Christian and the ethnicity is something that is beginning to take shape of contemporary Greekness, whatever it would be, with a long kind of bridge that leads back to classic antiquity, sort of over the first Byzantine and then Ottoman period. So I think we needed this sort of basic investigations and also the help of a number of kind of revisionist art historians who are working, historians predominantly and archaeologists working on those subjects to understand a little bit the contemporary situation of Athens. And I think that in the exhibition, and not only through the work of ethnically Greek or Athenian artists who were part of the show, but also through many direct and indirect ways, through contributions of international artists, we were able to actually see and learn quite a bit about Athens and Greece. However, the exhibition was never declared to be, you know, kind of thematic show about Athens.
Yeah, certainly. If you look on the website of Documenta, there is also one word that often appears there is the word public. It was the public exhibition, public programs, publication, but also public TV or public radio. So how do you see this word public in relation to Documenta? Or what does it mean for you? Because the word is often being overused nowadays with kind of unclear meaning.
Well, this kind of excessive use of the word public in naming of different sections and levels of the exhibition was meant to increase the kind of attention of of the public to their own role in the exhibition. So to kind of make us all more aware of the fact that we are constituting the public, and there is no public for which certain things are being done and served. For instance, if you call television or radio today public, it sounds almost like a provocation, because everything is increasingly more and more privatized. And we saw a chance in the fact that the Greek state television channel ERT was reinstated with much controversy also by the left-wing government of Syriza-led coalition. We saw this reinstatement of a public TV channel also as a chance to bring in the content that 30, 40 years ago was maybe typical for public televisions in different countries, including then socialist countries, where cultural programming was on incredibly high level, which has never been reached by, for instance, televisions after the change of 1989. So we wanted to bring this type of content into what is nominally public television, which is simply the state television, and which has very limited means for the kind of ambitious programming. And in this way, that part of Documenta, which was called public television or Kimena or TEX, was created, and that was a series of over 50 broadcasts every Monday late in the evening. There would be a block of material, documentaries, features, artist films, and so forth, things that you would never really see on any television, including Arte, I think. So it was kind of like an example, what life could look like should we have access to the media on this scale. And same thing was with the radio, where basically sort of mini radios were established in different parts of the globe and then kind of collected together in one series of radio broadcasts in collaboration with Deutschlandfunk that was called Savvy Radio in Berlin. And then, of course, one cannot not notice that, in the very idea of publications or publishing, there is something very essentially, about the public dimension of such activities. So it's not just about printed matter that accompanies the exhibition, but it's about establishing a conversation through the printed word mostly, and hence came the magazine, South as a State of Mind, and the subsequent publications, the Reader and the Daybook and a few others.
In the Reader that you published also, there is one text that caught my attention, which is a text from Tony Bennett called Exhibitionary Complex. And he gives somehow a correlation with the Foucaultian panopticon and the rise of the modern museum in the 19th century as a kind of machine that orders the things and creates the truth. So when you were speaking about the public and about a certain knowledge, so how is the relation between Documenta and a certain of affirmation or creation of the truth? If we would look back at the traditional institutions such as museums.
I would say that the various concepts of truth as preserved and presented in museums have to be ideologically first understood and then deconstructed and then transformed. And perhaps an exhibition can make a small contribution to such process, namely of shaking those regimes of truth that are directly related to existing relations of power. And one example is that at the point when you try to loan certain artworks or artifacts into an exhibition which is nominally dedicated to contemporary art, such as Documenta, you suddenly encounter huge obstacles because the institutions that control this sort of regimes or mini regimes of truth, which are very often museums and various other cultural institutions that are at the moment still in the making, such as the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. Humboldt Forum, as you probably know, is an institution that is going to be there to kind of manage the what used to be called the ethnographic collections, or collections of different museums that were gathered in the process that is rather kind of more similar to pillaging, to looting, than to any form of legitimate collecting, if such exists. And therefore, if you want to borrow objects that are meant to be part of that Humboldt Forum's future discourse that is going to kind of establish a new regime of truth more compatible to the present era, and not so openly based on colonial prejudice and maybe analyzing and kind of scratching this colonial prejudice to some degree, then you basically get a no. You get a straight no that is basically an expression of fear that certain meanings may go out of control, because in this case, the state-funded, the state-established institution would not have a control over interpretation of certain artifacts, and in this case I'm talking about the so-called Benin bronzes that were robbed by the British punitive expedition from the palace of the Kingdom of Benin in, I think, 1896, and then ended up in, among other places, the British Museum and the collections of Dahlem Museum in Berlin. So you want to take one of these objects out of this kind of museological apparatus, or out of the exhibitionary sort of systematics to which it belongs, and then you very clearly understand where the limits of the freedom of interpretation and the freedom of basically showing and seeing and curating and so on and so forth. So,
were there any other cases that you would like to mention?
Yes, there were many other such cases. For instance, of course, the first case, which kind of set the parameters for future problems of Documenta 14 with loans, or with getting certain loans, was the infamous so-called Goulet Estate, and here the obstruction was more of legal and bureaucratic nature. So we were told that it is impossible to include the entire or part of Goulet Estate in the exhibition, because there is no decision of the public prosecutor according to which the estate that was temporarily first confiscated by the German police and then sort of kept locked in a storage under jurisdiction of the public prosecutor, so that this estate, which consisted of works of very often dubious provenance, and the entire estate, coming from the German art historian, and then art dealer, and then the art dealer for the Nazi Reich, and then the director of the Kunsthalle in Düsseldorf until his death in 1956. So this estate is essentially problematic. It's not the individual objects only that are of problematic provenance, and of course provenance research can explain the source or the way one or another art object entered the collection, but there is also a larger issue, and maybe this is in a certain way the issue of truth, which is something that you ask about in the beginning. So how do we judge, and how do we see today? Can we see in a kind of non-mediated way a kind of convolute or ensemble of works that are coming from both, the family collection of Gurlitt, and yet some objects are evidently coming into the collection through maybe not the blatant looting, but through kind of acquisition under a condition of duress from predominantly Jewish owners of these artworks in the 1930s and early 1940s. So, okay, this is another example of a kind of impossibility of showing something that you want to show. And in the end, exhibitions are about showing things.
But would you be able to develop more on how this museum structure system should change? Would it be, for example, in the way to expose the history of the different artifacts that are presented in the collections, including the economical and political and other histories related to those objects?
Maybe I would have one indirect response that is somehow also inspired by the experience of this space here, which is the Baumarkt, or the former kind of department store.
Hobby market, they are calling it actually.
Okay, hobby market. But architecturally, it's not very far from Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin. So it's a kind of basic, modern structure. Even the dimensions, I think, are comparable to the Neue Nationalgalerie, and yet Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin is undergoing the meticulous renovation and further enhancement of the architectural qualities of the space, which is by David Chipperfield, while this space is slated for demolition within a few years and temporarily serves as a site of, let's say, experimentation on both artistic and institutional level. And what I find interesting about this space is that it doesn't hide its history, and it doesn't hide the kind of economy that once made it possible, and that same economy that soon thereafter made it completely useless, obsolete, and in the end disused. So you can see the kind of cataloging system. If we imagine that we are in the storage of the museum or in a library, we would also have departments. That would be, for instance, department of, if this was an art museum, we would have a department of Flemish painting, and somewhere else we would have Spanish painting and so forth. And here we have obkladačky and barwy, laki, and so forth. So it's a kind of existing system that was once present and which is still kind of readable in this very flexible and very open space. So the interesting thing about such spaces is that they can be completely redefined and temporarily used. And I think that this is what one can try to do with institutions. Instead of setting new paradigm that is supposed to last, maybe a temporary takeover or kind of hold up performed on the institution or on the whole system of meaning related to an institution could be very productive. And this can relate to both commercial structure and to a museum.
But it also exists because of a decision of politicians, of the local politicians in Ostrava. So in Documenta you also established something that was called Parliament of Bodies, right? And when I was listening to the opening talk, you talk about the crisis of the democratical system, of the system where people are electing other people to represent them, and about the failure of those people that are supposed to represent them. So how was political? How was Documenta grounded politically, or how do you see that we could overcome this crisis of the system, or was Documenta supposed to give some answers or models for that?
Well, I think it was not really as ambitious as to formulate a kind of response on a global scale, but Parliament of Bodies was a specific type of practice in which the participants constituted a kind of changing configurations of speakers and those who responded to the speakers in the kind of architectural setting that was meant to be lacking a center and lacking directionality, and this was difficult to avoid, and sometimes this directional character, which for instance is very present here, so we on this side and they on that side, had tendency to reconstitute itself. But I think on the whole, all the sessions of Parliament of Bodies, which was a proposal by Paul B. Preciado to give a shape or shapes to what we wanted to be public programs of Documenta, was definitely one such experiment that tried to go back to, I would say, imagined origins of democratic debate. Because whether the debate ever was truly democratic, that we don't really know, or we rather know that it wasn't. So democracy was always something that included some and excluded some others. So we were trying to be aware of the shortcomings of the democratic model and of the dangers of imagining it as something that was once perfect and now is lost and only needs to be reinstated. No, it's probably something that needs to be rather perpetually reinvented, and it can only happen through participation and debate, and not through this kind of model in which the decisions are left to individuals who win their democratic mandate through the procedures that are democratic, but then in the end bring to power, the leaders who are rather the opposite to the common sense would understand as democratic. And the covers of today's newspapers are pretty well testifying to this state of things, because suddenly you have a league of gentlemen, including Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Assad, and with several, smaller leaders running around, and there's a kind of muscle flexing going on in which, people die every day and nothing really changes. I don't think, and none of us would reasonably think that this is what we wanted, the democracy to be. So it has to be somehow questioned and thought anew.
But what can contemporary art do about this?
I think specifically contemporary art and kind of cultural production has rather a lot to do, because it can propose models that are not bound to the kind of again the regime of immediate accountability, which can be also constructed in such a way that basically you will be never able to formulate a proposal within a system that changes the system from inside. So you have to formulate proposals within another system, and maybe the system of artistic production is a good terrain, like a vague terrain from which to make such proposals and to try to shake things up, to change things step by step. Otherwise, I don't see the point, in working in this field, I guess.
And does this have to do something with the also often mentioned nature of the works of Documenta that were very often performative or ephemeral or non-material, but on the other hand, very often material in some sense of commodity materials? Or how did you thought about this? How did you thought from the political dimension about the works of art when it comes to their form?
I think it's rather the way of looking at things that is commodifying things in the end, and not one or another genre in itself is bound to become commodity. So of course, one could argue that it's a bit more difficult to commodify performance, and maybe performance artwork, can be only sold posteriorly through documentation, or it can be preserved in a museum in the form of a score, and so forth. And the painting is something that is pretty handy and out there, hanging on the wall, can be transported. It's not too big. Okay, but this is only about kind of practical stuff. But we see very often that it's the way of looking at artwork that can activate the potential of transformation in the eye and the mind of beholder. So whether it's through experience of intensely looking at painting, such as for instance that described by T.J. Clarke in his book on two paintings of Nicolas Poussin. Or it is through the kind of immersive experience of performance work that can extend for many days, or through an experience of building an entirely different format of an institution. There are many ways. All these ways are valid. It's just about the way of using tools, I think, rather than about the kind of immutable nature of tools.
But does it have to do also something with like the utility notion or another kind of dimensions of the artworks than the artifact or the commodity? Like the utility notion of it. Like because the contemporary modern art somehow depends on this contemplative paradigm of these objects being artifacts of contemplation or aesthetic pleasure, rather than parts of some social or political, in maybe the sense of the non-European arts, or maybe in the sense of a... I would just like to know whether you were also trying to re-question the status of the artwork. I guess you did, but I would just like to hear in which possible ways or somehow.
Well, we brought several indigenous artists into Documenta 14, immediately provoking a kind of first-level moralistic critique of of those who said it was exploitation and so forth. But nevertheless, I believe that the fear of being accused of exploitation is not a good excuse for not dealing with artistic practices of indigenous people at all. So it's a matter of how you do it. If you do it by asking those who are either producers, or those who know, or those who have a kind of ancestral lines that transport certain meanings that are inherent to this production, then I think it is a valid attempt to include indigenous artifacts and indigenous artists in the kind of making of an exhibition such as Documenta. On the other hand, you mentioned performance. Yes, of course. I mean, the inclusion of performance practice in even these large exhibitions is nothing very new, and I think Documenta had a pretty strong part that was focusing on the scores for performances and musical scores and so forth. But I think it was embedded in a larger interest in interpretation as a process in which the fixed meaning gets undone and new meanings can enter the game. In this way, maybe producing this impression of the show, being rather made of loose ends and not an experience, an exercise of a kind of rigid expression, for instance, which to me always has to do with death. This kind of rigor in conceptualizing and displaying in art exhibitions.
What about the selection of the artists? Because even though the list of the artists was published very late, and I also understood that you were trying to avoid this listing, in some ways as a curator you need to select the artist. From at least looking at the list, there were many non-European artists. There were many non-known or non-famous artists. So what were the criteria or how you were working on this?
Well, if curators need to select artists, then they selected them. And there were many curators who were part of the team, also curatorial advisors and others. And each of them brought a number of, let's say, positions and rather questions into the show, which then ended up in being this sort of cloud that we really tried not to
conceptualize.
Not to count, not to make a list, alphabetic or other. We were not really aware up to a certain point who is really in the show, Like none of us in charge of the curatorial tasks had a full picture. So quite consciously we sailed into this kind of situation in which you believe that you know, but you probably don't know exactly, and there was never a kind of whiteboard on which all these names are present, and then you stare at them with 10 fellow curators and you try to make sense out of it. It was more like working on, I think the show had more like an insular character, and I think, what I see here again in this space is like a way of working with openness or the void, and that is interesting because of course you can build a lot of partition walls and you can make sections and segments, but you can work also in a more open way and introduce certain permeability or liquidity, and also allow people to stroll through the exhibition in a non-prescribed way. So people are not told that they have to, of course they enter through kind of stanofilko, so there is some kind of conditioning going on here, but it's reduced to reasonable minimum, and as you enter you notice like different islands that you identified as kind of significant spots, and there's people gathering at some of them, so you go there because people are social animals, so you want to kind of meet your fellow people at the bar or somewhere. So this is more or less like how I think a large exhibition works. It creates like different moments of density, and then it has moments of a kind of that are just opposite. That are moments of like almost like entropic.
So there is a certain opacity as well, or ambivalence, because also here when you're coming to the parking lot, you may not know that this is an art center.
Yeah, I like this notion of exhibition being rather opaque. I think that this is something that we tried to test a little bit in the Berlin Biennial in 2008, where we also used the space of Neue Nationalgalerie because it represented a certain typology that was one of the fundamental let's say spaces to show, types of space to show art in the 20th century, which is an open space, and Mies van der Rohe had a solution to that because architects tend to have solutions to everything, and he designed very handy, suspended white boards of a certain size, probably using the golden section or some other clever way of measuring these backdrops, and on them he hang, paintings of his Musée Imaginaire long before exhibitions were actually done in the Neue Nationalgalerie. That was only finished in the late 60s. And when it was finished, it was already kind of obsolete as an art space because it belonged to an era that was like, 10 years earlier perhaps, and that actually found its fulfillment in, for instance, buildings designed on the other side of Atlantic by the architect Lina Bobardi. So I think the kind of ambivalence of an exhibition set in a certain space is predicated on the fact that the space is never the perfect space for a given kind of work. So the work has to enter the relationship of dialogue or maybe kind of treachery or some kind of problematic relationship with the space, and then sometimes it maybe works.
But so is this ambivalence or opacity also related to the language that we speak about art? Is this ambivalence or opacity also related to the language? Because also Documenta consisted of many texts or spoken word and things. Yeah,
luckily the language, at least apparently, offers us a possibility of being clear. Especially currently, certain, I would say, terseness and exactitude, if such words exist, is something that should be rather valued. And I think the opacity of the language, even the opacity of the poetic image, is something that I would question. The famed ambiguity of poetic image is the most concise and the most precise form of communication that probably exists. Rather contrary to, for instance, the telephone book, unless one reads telephone book as poetry.
But so would this also be able to be interpreted as that you would like to somehow break the kind of enlightenment paradigm of the clearness or rationality, or
to show that it's shattered, yes, that it doesn't really hold, you know, anymore. And here, I mean, we go back to why we republished the kind of seminal essay of Tony Bennett on exhibitionary complex in the reader, because we like to repeat in this Documenta. You know, this Documenta was not meant to be about absolute or like invention of originality. It was meant to be sometimes about very didactic gestures of repetition of certain things that have been formulated with considerable effort and then maybe forgotten. And this counts for both artworks and it counts also for texts. And the text by Tony Bennett, which was written in 1980s, was very strikingly actual, current. It had a strong resonance, let's say, for today, because Bennett basically he goes through the development of large contemporary exhibition from the 19th century trade fairs through the kind of transition into something like Venice Biennial, which kind of appears as a way of putting art in this context of national achievements, very much similar like achievements of national industries at that time. So exhibition gains a kind of new format, which is that of a large, you know, biennial, and then the Whitney Biennial appears later for different reasons and so forth. So Bennett goes through this history a little bit, and then he kind of firmly places this exhibitionary complex as one of the kind of disciplinary apparatuses of or born of the Enlightenment, next to the prison, the clinic, and so forth. So on the one hand, we wanted to publish this essay because it is printed in a book that is not so immediately available, we thought, especially not to you know, all visitors to Documenta. On the other hand, we asked Tony Bennett to write a little sequel text and to kind of reflect a bit on what maybe, you know, changed. But he has not really, what changed since the time when he wrote it, 30 or so years ago. but I think he decided to uphold main lines of his argument. He only noted that the kind of consolidation of the art market and the kind of what we call art world has been nearly perfected today, and that nothing really surprising or opposite came out of that system that was in the process of assuming shape already in the 80s, and that reached its current kind of multi-dimensional and pretty monstrous form today.
And could you maybe say also something about Edouard Glissant, and because he also used a lot the term opacity, but maybe in relation to the colonial, post-colonial studies. You also included some of his text, I believe, in your reader, and there is also this notion of world mentality.
Yeah, I think the very notion of the world has made a considerable career lately through exhibitions such as All the World's Future, for instance, where this seems to be the only term that is kind of saved from the abuse, perhaps in an authoritarian way. So yes, the world mentality as a kind of possibility of being together that is not assuming a kind of ideological unity of some kind of new international, but more a kind of attempted coexistence. Yeah, that is something that maybe was on the horizon of the text and also efforts of the artists in this exhibition, especially that this is something that doesn't seem to be coming into being today at all, and rather on the contrary, sadly.
And sorry, I'm gonna try to impose some kind of message on the ambivalence and opacity, but many people I spoke perceived Documenta as the exhibition that was predominantly about exclusion. Would you agree about this? Also maybe in relation to the post-colonialism and other forms of exclusion?
Yeah. Yeah, I think as much as it was a kind of attempt to bring together like different forms of resistance to exclusion historically, beginning with a kind of formation of colonial empires and the laws introduced by those colonial empires and the types of architecture introduced to hold slaves and the type of transport involved and the type of return transport of goods, which has a lot to do with a kind of accumulation of wealth by countries such as United Kingdom and many other countries. Yes, so the exhibition tried to rather frontally address these different forms of exclusion in order to arrive at the current moment in which this exclusion very simply, manifests itself like every day through, for instance, very simple acts, in pretty relaxed circumstances of the Athens airport today. I was, waiting for about an hour and a half for departure of the Ryanair flight to the Polish or Silesian city of Katowice. So about to take this improbable leap from Athens to, to this used to be industrial heart or something of Poland after the Second World War, now in the state of like half decay, half transformation. But before I boarded the plane, I noticed that there was a policeman standing next to the nicely dressed lady at the gate, and this policeman was checking, some passport, and obviously the only criterion he applied was the criterion of skin color. So he singled out about 6 individuals who did not look like Greeks or did not look like Polish or Czechs. They looked like something else, and he very thoroughly checked their passports, and none of them made it to the plane. And this reminded me the poster that I saw one day before in a small airport in a city in the north of Greece called Kavala, and this airport was recently bought by a larger company called Fraport, which is a German company. So Fraport bought 14 airports in Greece for what some people say not so much money, and now Fraport is investing what they declare on big posters in this airport, 400 million euro in infrastructural improvements of Greek airports until the year 2021. So on the one hand, you have the idea of this infrastructural improvement and investment. On the other hand, there is a profit or a hope for profit involved because the airports were bought cheap by, kind of huge kind of corporate entity. And then there was a next poster, and the next poster represented some happy travelers, white privileged individuals, and the slogan was something like, traveling is a natural right, or something like that, So when I saw this poster, I thought like, something is really wrong here. But one day later, when I was taking a flight to Katowice, I understood that something is really very thoroughly wrong, and you see it every day. So these are some of the reasons why we decided to address exclusion in Documenta, because it's, simply speaking, one of the most burning problems and needs of the day, to address it like every day, everywhere, all the time, because otherwise, things will just remain the same and much, much worse. This exclusion is, of course, it's related to racial, but also gender criteria and many other criteria, that are being set in order to basically manage the biomass that is available, which is, which can be also extended to, how the so-called audience is normally considered, pre-formatted, and kind of infantilized.
And so is debt, for example, part of this? Is debt
Yes. Politics of debt is known to be one of the means to keep populations under control and to maximize profits. I mean, this is ABC.
And so how do you, forgive me the question, but how do you see the development after the end, or already at the end of Documenta, concerning the financial deficit of the Documenta according to some of the politicians created, maybe in relation to this?
Well, it's an expression of a lack of compatibility between a vision of an exhibition and the intention of the participants, meaning artists, theorists, writers, and all those who made it possible, and in the end also those who came to see the exhibition and who bought a ticket for something like 23 euro, in this way becoming, shareholders on a mini scale of the whole enterprise. So on the one hand, you have an intention of building this exhibition by the kind of common effort of so many individuals. On the other hand, you have the kind of passivity and I would say learned helplessness of political representatives who are meant to give this project a kind of life that it deserves, and who authorize those who are working on the exhibition on realizing exactly this project, and then it turns out that it's impossible to make two exhibitions for a cost of one. and this is exactly what happens. So we went slightly over the budget. Some would say that in objective figures it's a huge amount, and certainly you can build a lot of very useful things for the amount of money that we actually overspend. But let's be frank and let's be specific and concrete. The exhibition also brought around 150 million euro into economy of the city of Kassel, and a lot of this money is being returned directly to the economy of the city, and a lot of it supports indirectly all businesses and whatever there is in Kassel that basically lives on this 100 days of Documenta. So on the one hand, there is a kind of managerial intention of keeping the numbers, the figures of the exhibition balanced or black, as Germans say. On the other hand, there is a kind of uninhibited appetite for economic profit that is exactly produced by the very exhibition that in newspapers, brings the deficit. So I don't know. I think there is certain totally retarded and reactionary political idea involved in this way of judging the exhibition that is obviously also related to certain political content that was present in the exhibition. It's not only about the figures, it's also about the debates that ensued and the problem with the obelisk of Ologibe, which is still standing on one of the central squares of Kassel, and it's being rather contested by the current municipal government of Kassel, or at least it's not fully embraced and endorsed. So I think one would have to see, one would have to look into rather complex field of forces that were unleashed in the process of making of the exhibition, while the exhibition was on and after it closed, in order to understand the kind of meaning that this deficit suddenly assumed as a kind of ultimate, final result of Documenta 14, which is interesting.
But so, which one of the elements you think, or you would say, created the biggest rage in the politicians? Was it moving the Documenta to Greece with the current discussion about the German-Greek relations, or you think it was the form of the artworks presented, or would it be possible to say that you think that was the most sensitive point?
Well, I think
and also which role media played in this, because I guess, as you already mentioned, they played a role in.
Well, first of all, not all media, some media, and we know that some media have tendency today to instantly, polarize. Negative critique sells better than the kind of hermeneutics. So obviously, the exhibition that produces controversy was meant to receive a very strong backlash from mostly conservative critique, including otherwise very, reliable and moderate newspapers such as Neue Zürcher Zeitung, who basically, reviewed or previewed also the exhibition through the articles written by a gentleman who, for instance, claimed that, after he heard that there was a deficit, he said, they probably, in the south, there is a lot of bribery and they steal stuff and so on. And this was written in Neue Zürcher Zeitung as a comment to the kind of financial issues of Documenta. So, if newspapers that are considered to be rather a trustworthy source of information and, like well-informed newspapers are, writing nonsense and, preying on stereotypes, then you can imagine what is happening in newspapers that have no ethics whatsoever, that are tabloids or close to tabloids, or that are just there to reproduce the kind of misinformation, produced elsewhere. So Yeah, I mean, media certainly, some media, of course, played a role, but this is not, media have to be seen in a kind of larger social field of how politics is done today, what social participation in the public exhibition is meant to mean, that is meant to mean something like a kind of delivery of something pleasant and palatable to the masses, and we just did not do it. I don't want to make exhibitions that do that. Even large exhibitions like Documenta,
But you don't think that also partially the role could play the kind of general aversion against the large exhibitions? Also in the year where there was Venice Biennale and others?
I did not observe any general aversion to the previous exhibition of Documenta. I observed very, pleasant, kind of satisfied mood of certain class of the art world participants, and in this Documenta it was different. It was just addressed maybe to different sectors of this art club and beyond it. So I don't think, the condemnation of large exhibitions en gros does not make much sense. One has to be more discerning in the critique, because, for instance, I truly believe that a biennial which is established, in a place where it represents a certain breakthrough, can be a very interesting thing. But a biennial established as a sort of instrument to kind of enhance the kind of tourist value of a place is something that is meant to fail. It's going to be not. It's never going to reach any kind of authentic dimension. It's never going to be the place in which artists feel that they are doing something significant. They might participate, but they don't feel that they are, in a significant context, and not each artist is able or interested in sort of critically redefining the context each time the work is produced. Some do, some not. Yeah.
So to change topic also, as we are in Ostrava and some people may think whether you're following the art development in the Central East Europe, and whether with interest, or because on Documenta there were not so many Eastern European artists, which is not a problem, of course. But
I don't know. I'm following a bit here and there, but not regionally. I don't, I don't have a particular focus on this or that kind of regional or national context. I like working with a kind of, among other things, I like working with phenomena that may occur on a kind of in a kind of specific place within a specific time, rather than with kind of larger fields, let's say. So therefore, there was a presence of small or not properly existing countries quite often in the Documenta, and there was a notable absence often of countries that are very large, and they are usually on the first pages of newspapers. But it was not an exclusion. It was more a kind of lack of capacity to explore this vastness of artistic production in those countries.
I think as we are getting slowly or quickly out of time, maybe we should give the opportunity now also the public to ask some questions. Yeah.
You said that art purpose for you is to deconstructing political structures and taking critics on it and maybe even changing the system. What is the difference between art, this kind of purpose of art, and people who are working in different professions, in different areas than art, and they are also being upset about their own surroundings. They are also looking ways to express the critics about it, maybe even show their feelings about it. What is the difference between such individualities which are not working in art, but in different areas of the society, in different professions, and the people who are working in arts? The other way around, maybe, would it be an advice for people, professionals of different kinds, who are also feeling uncomfort with the system and they are working in and they are living in, to get back to this classical education about arts, philosophy, and logic, and so on. But what is the difference in the end about arts and people who are also using critics about the system from different areas?
But this way of formulating the question, are they also artists? You know, it betrays a kind of expected longing of those who are not yet promoted to the artistic class. I mean, this is how the question reads, but I think that it's rather, you know, it's the artists who are in trouble. It's the artists who are always in trouble of how to step down, you know, from the kind of pedestal on which certain bourgeois concept of art put them, and they kind of hang on this pedestal still halfway. So, you know, everybody's trying to, in a very measured and kind of like considered way, try to find a way of kind of, you know, joining something of a society, or, you know, be useful. I mean, I had this discussion a million times about, you know, to which degree the work of an artist is relevant, you know, in how far does it change social relationship, how does it, if and how it produces a kind of new social reality. And I think that the antinomy of the activist and the artistic position is thoroughly false. It's thoroughly false, and it's constructed as false by a certain, you know, bourgeois vision of art, in which basically one says, okay, there's, you know, this art is kind of not art because it's like more like activism, you know, or form of political action and so forth. I don't think that it has to be necessarily on such opposite poles, you know. And I also don't think that this is like with Joseph Beuys, who claims that, you know, art has a certain you know, social function, and therefore he says everybody should be an artist, you know. So not everybody should be an artist, not at all.
If it's quick,
my idea was rather there are people in different professions than the artistic ones who also see the trouble of the system in the very special environment in which they are working, in their own professions. And they are also sometimes, most of the time resigning, but sometimes still trying to express their criticism, their feelings about the system. And my idea was rather, is it an idea to join people who are really professionals from outside arts? Because you said it's not possible to change the system from being inside the system, and it's true that the professionals want to stay in the system. They still want to act in the system, they still want to earn money in the system. But I guess probably it's the same in the art world. Rather than these thoughts about taking criticism and wanting to change something in the way we are feeling about it, this is something common between the way of the purpose of art that you mentioned and the feelings of people being in the different areas of this social or this life altogether. And do you think art is could be the better way to express their feelings about the system, or the other way around? Well, how to join, maybe how to enforce this feelings, this criticism, which is not only in the art world, but also in other professions. I don't want to say everyone should be an artist. Rather than, do you think that artistic means, however they are defined, are the better way, or what is the plus of it for people who are not artists, who are not educated artists, but want also to take part in this criticism and in a change?
I think the difference is perhaps that the artists and similar, they are trading in the business of expression, and those who, for instance, produce something like an object, like a tool, for instance, or those who who work in fields, or who design something, computers. They just do. They make things that are then more directly used. There is a different bodily and use relationship to the product. And in case so the question of like how the others can express still presupposes a kind of higher position of expression, but it's also by doing things, I guess, that people can, so to say, express their sentiments. And for instance, I had a very interesting conversation with a product designer lately, and I think that her work is through and through political, but it's not through what she says about these objects that she tries to make. It's about what they are made of, what sort of history is behind them, how they are used, who is using them, at which price, and so forth. So I think there are ways of acting politically in different professions, and not necessarily the artistic profession. I don't consider artistic profession as superior, not at all. I consider it on equal with other professions. It's just some people do one thing, other people do another thing. I don't see a kind of hierarchical relationship between these different ways of doing things.
Můžete se ptát i v češtině, samozřejmě.
I was wondering, what do you think about the global art system, which is being discussed nowadays, if it's a part of art market? And you were speaking about different strategies of resistance you were trying to develop within the Documenta. Maybe if you can say something about that. And if the large exhibition in itself isn't a part of this global art system in a way.
Well, I don't know what is this global art system. I know that there is an art market that is mostly made of, what is kind of defined. The value gets established through a kind of accumulation, that starts at some point on the turn of 60s and 70s with establishment of the first modern type of art fair, which until now plays the crucial role, and everything else is a derivative of that. So you can say that this is, but there's no such thing as like one unified art system. There are different, so to say, areas or fields which interact and which are sometimes on completely, I would say even an art fair established to promote or distribute a certain type of art that is, for instance, not at all included in the kind of Western European gallery system can, to a degree, play a role, because it provides information, it makes people aware of the work. Maybe there is a lack of public institutions that may represent this type of artistic production, and so forth. So I don't think that Documenta try to, be against some kind of imagined art system. I don't see, the shape of such enemy. I think there are much more concrete moments in which one can address, injustice or exclusion and so forth. But like to conceive an exhibition in order to fight the art market, I find it a bit of a, beyond the ambitions such exhibition should take. Poking fun at Jeff Koons, it's pleasant, but it's also boring. At certain point we have to really leave these things where they are. We have to leave them where they belong, and we have to try to get busy with something else. So I would say that instead of going on a crusade against some kind of idea of art market, art system, and so forth, it is better to think about establishing other forms of distribution, mediation, production, of artistic content, be it in literature, fine arts, or in whichever other way, or film.
I would maybe have like a less, let's say, general question. If I understand it right, you still pretty much live in Athens, or you're still active in Athens somehow. Can you maybe tell us something about, in retrospect, or like it's been kind of almost 1 year since Documenta is over or is finished in Athens, like what kind of feeling, like in retrospect, is there? Is let's say, the criticism of the local art scene still somehow, let's say, present? Or I mean, I've been, for example, or like encountered, let's say, opinions of people like Iliana Fokiniaki, if I'm saying right her name, who's not far in a physical space from this Greek Museum of Contemporary Art, kind of doing the same things as you are describing, I would say, but on a smaller level. So was there a chance to somehow get or move on with the local scene, or change the relationships, let's say, in a distance from the exhibition, or how is it now? Like, what is the retrospect, let's say, in Athens?
Yeah, I think there are multiple responses, and some of them are louder and have their own media, and they make it through the kind of general indifference of the recipients. So names of certain critics of Documenta are in the meantime becoming popular, and they're, some of them are getting jobs, which is a good thing in itself. And I think Documenta produced a lot of new relations within the local, let's say, art scene, or however you call it, in its different parts, the art school and all institutions that were involved, and all the groupings of artists, and the biennial, of course, which right now, for the first time received money from the region of Attica for the upcoming 2 editions, which is something that has not happened before. Of course, we did not go to the region of Attica and tell them it's worth supporting biennial, but I think somebody at the region of Attica must have, opened eyes and start thinking that maybe it's important to support structures of local art production. So I think there are many direct and indirect effects of Documenta. I don't see pictures of terrible destruction, or kind of, dozens of people who feel exploited and kind of emptied by the fact that we organized Documenta in Athens, mostly, with a lot of Athenian and Greek people, including a lot of them in the team, and being able to offer them decent wages in the sector in which there's no decent wages at all in Greece. I don't know. I think most accusations to me reek of some kind of moralism, like kind of moralistic, strange kind of leftist moralism, which is a very bizarre phenomenon. I think there's a kind of reactionary moment in this kind of leftist critique that feels threatened in its privilege to be actually the critical voice, you know. So when you go there, you automatically become a target from both left and right. And I think in that sense also, Documenta wanted to be rather a scapegoat in Athens than to be the savior, or to, you know, we didn't come to offer solution, and we didn't come at all. We just lived there for a time being, you know. And we were kind of vulnerable enough and not clever enough to expose ourselves to this kind of critique, which I think was part of our task there. You know, it is to make these things visible, like a kind of the German word is like Blitzableitung, you know, where the lightning strikes and it goes into the earth on this kind of thin wire, you know. So this is what we more or less, I think, tried to be, and you know, it did provoke a considerable commotion, let's say, or kind of regrouping in the institutional field and so forth. And who knows, maybe. You know, it's disputable if Athens right now can afford and sustain contemporary art museum, but definitely we help to make this question resound in public debate by stubbornly involving the Hellenic Museum of Contemporary Art, EMST, in the exhibition both in Athens and in Kassel. So it's just one example, but it was rather about producing a series of practical questions, and not about saying, you know, everything is going to be fine because we came here and now we fix. No, we kind of unfixed.
Okay, I have sort of a very practical question. So you decided for Documenta, you decided to collaborate with more graphic design teams or studios. It was actually maybe, I don't know precisely 5. But it was Mavis van Dorsen for South Magazine, Firfim for captions and merchandise, Ludovic Ballant for Reader, right? And then I don't keep track anymore, maybe you will, but anyways, my question is, was this decision also sort of part of when talking about ambivalency and opacity, was it sort of strategic decision also, which was like the graphic design was sort of, let's say, support for this strategy to be ambivalent like this?
Yes. Yes, yes, because normally when you arrive as a kind of artistic director with your artistic freedoms to such exhibition, you're confronted with a number of parameters that you are nominally supposed to follow, and one of these parameters you have to, you know, this is the part of the ritual called let's find the graphic designer. So what you do is you organize a pitch, and in the pitch you invite like your best graphic designers that you know, and then they are kind of like sweating and suffering, and you choose the best. But you know, they were all really good and interesting, and they had very different like philosophies of design. So we could expect a lot of turbulence also, like how they align or not, you know, their kind of proposals. So we took them all, but we gave them different tasks, and it was also practical solution because there's so much stuff to produce that we didn't think that any of these offices that are not like industrial scale offices but rather small and, you know, kind of focused would really do the job for the whole thing. And we did not want one kind of branding, you know. So in the end we are at least left with these ambivalences, like, you know, this is the Documenta reduced to just the number by Firfin, and this is like kind of one of the first logos by Lawrence Brunner and Julia Born, and yeah, that was part of this intention to dissolve the identity and to not go for like CI, but rather the opposite.
I think it was a very bold decision, but do you have some feedback from audience? Like, do you think that they perceive it as you expected, or wasn't it confusing?
There were very strong reactions, especially to the signage system. You know, the floor labels or scrolls in Athens on which people stepped. This was something that was considered, you know, really annoying by many people, and some other people found it very inspiring and so forth. And I think the problem with the signage of Mavis van Dorsen in Kassel was that people were just taking the labels from the wall like this. So other people had an impression that we forgot labels, but we didn't forget them. They were stolen like in the first 2 hours. So yeah, I mean, you know, if you want to allow experiments with graphic design, you are going to have a lot of very annoyed people going after you and telling you that this is just wrong. And yeah.
Tak ještě nějaké otázky, nestýďte se.
Přece jenom. Kdo?
I have one more question. Like the German theoretician Wolfgang Ulrich, his idea was, or his projection was, it's also like echoing what you were saying, that in the future there's going to be a schism in the art, and one part of the art will be produced for art market, and the other art is going to be like so-called curator's art. Do you think the tendency is realistic, what he is saying?
But curators are not saints. I mean, curators work for the market, you know, one way or another. So it's very difficult to produce art that will kind of out itself from, you know, take itself out from the market. I think that it's a. I mean, I did not, you know, go into details of the argument of this theorist, but I find it a bit too. You know, I would not just like, you know, have curators on one side and the greedy, you know, dealers and collectors on the other side. I think there is a complot between these professions, and you know, this is more or less the system of which you spoke before, and this complot is nothing new. It's just the market, you know. So there is a supply and there is a demand, and there is an interpretation process in between. So to break these supply chains and introduce opacity, you know, kind of trouble with interpretation and so forth into this mechanism is really challenging, and it can be done from many different sides, not only from curators.
Performativní ticho. Last chance. Nobody's care. Okay. Thank you very much. Adam Szymczyk, Michal Novotný.